Hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure and an honor to host this panel in the context of the first Global Forum on Democratizing Work. We have three outstanding women on this panel to discuss the stakes vis-à-vis the gig economy. As you might know, the Democratizing Work movement started from an op-ed that was published during the first lockdown and which eventually was signed by thousands of academics. The op-ed was about the role that essential workers play in our society and how undervalued they are in our economic system. The op-ed really tackled three principles that should be addressed together if we want to remedy the situation in which we find ourselves today. That is, to democratize the firm, to decommodify labor, and to decarbonize the planet. These three principles are considered in the op-ed turned manifesto as containing the seeds for a totally alternative mode of economic organization that would value first human beings and living beings on this planet and would enable our economy to be true to the planetary boundaries that we absolutely need to respect. We have the pleasure to have in the context, I forgot one point. So the op-ed being so resonant across the continents because academics from 750 different universities signed that op-ed that you can find at democratizingwork.org. The resonance of the op-ed seemed so big, so universal, that we decided we had to organize a global forum to be able to discuss these principles, to engage also way beyond academia. And so this forum is the occasion to have various constituencies coming to discuss together. And when I mean constituencies, I mean the various people who are concerned with these stakes, who are concerned with these principles, and who should absolutely discuss them together. It is obviously the workers first. These are the ones who are concerned. The labor movement, unions, climate activists, progressive elected officials, human rights organizations, citizens, all, of course, have a great relevance to these three principles and the quest for a more just and sustainable economic system. So today, in the context of the first day of the forum, which is really discussing the democratizing principle, we have a great number of participants, 2,200 people registered from across the globe, coming from 79 countries, meaning that this is truly a global conversation, and we are really happy about that. This panel is going to discuss the gig economy as the best and worst case scenario for democratizing work. Indeed, the idea is that we can see in this evolution of the platform or the gig economy, we can see capitalism as its worst, and we can also maybe identify, and obviously that's a nod to the work done by Juliet Schor, some extremely important seeds for an alternative way to organize the economy. So we propose to follow the following steps. We're going to hear from our three panelists who are going to introduce themselves first, and then they will take turn to introduce their own remark about how they see these stakes. We will hear from Nicole from Veena Dubal and from Juliet Schor. So I suggest first that we hear from you so that you can introduce yourself. As I said, we want to have a really participatory, in an egalitarian mode conversation, and so I'm not going to go into lengthy bibliography, but first to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and then they will speak for 7 minutes each, and then we'll have half an hour to engage with your questions. We will take questions in the Q&A column. So you see on the right side of your screen, you have a few columns. You have chat. You can see the users that are present in this panel, the Q&A section. And so please post your question in the Q&A because that will obviously help my job. So first, a round of introduction, and now I pass the floor to Nicole.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Nicole Moore. I live in Los Angeles, California, and I'm a part-time Lyft driver, and I work for a couple other platforms in addition to having a regular day job, which I'm at right now on my lunch hour. So I wanted to let you know how I got started in what we call the gig economy. It's or the platform economy. I mean, really, it is just regular work that's deployed by an app on your phone. And it's a low bar to get into the work. And so for many of us, it's a good opportunity to make money. I do it part-time, but the majority of miles driven in the platform-based transportation are driven by full-time drivers. So I got into this work because I had another issue, which is that right now housing in many of our big cities is completely unaffordable. We had a mortgage that was one of the bad loans that they basically give to certain people in the economy, and we could not, we reached a point where it just skyrocketed and there was no way we could pay for our housing. And so, you know, we cut out all our expenses and it was clear we needed more income. And so I went to start driving, and I would turn off my, I would go to the parking lot after my day job, turn on the app and start driving. And, you know, it did put cash in the bank, but you quickly learn that it's a losing game. You know, as a worker, you're basically financing the factory. The entire fleet is owned by us, the drivers. And honestly, it's not that expensive to run an app. It's expensive to run a car. And, you know, my first thing that happened to me was I needed 4 new tires. I have never needed 4 new tires in my entire life, but I was driving a lot. So, and then I started to put the math together, and you realize that you're basically cutting your bumper off to pay the mortgage, the groceries, whatever. And, you know, I started to hear stories of colleagues, you know, who like their transmission went out after 2.5 years of full-time driving. And basically they went homeless because not only could they not afford the transmission, but they couldn't afford housing. And so, you know, I knew people who made the choice to go through the company rental program. So you're renting a car from the company, spending, you know, like $250, $275 a week. And then you decide that that's going to be your rent and you live in your car. I mean, it's a horrible, horrible way of working, and it's not unusual. So when you talk about, you know, we started organizing, and this was back in 2018. And some of us who knew each other from the airport, we, you know, because that's like one of the places that you congregate as drivers. And there was first a couple of little protests that we did, and we knew we had to grow. And so we built our own hybrid organizing model. that is both app-based. We have our own app that we've made homemade, plus it's based on real relationship building, grassroots organizing, and we started to build an organization. Rideshare Drivers United is what we're called, and we're now 20,000 drivers across California. And we started fighting, and we started figuring out, how are we going to get fair pay? How are we going to get, a guaranteed benefits and that kind of thing? And, the bottom line is that we already had those rights to minimum wage and the right to have a union, but the companies shirk their responsibility in order to pay us less. And, they don't follow the law anywhere. So, what we began to do was focus our energy on, first of all, codifying what we knew was true, which is that we were due basic labor rights, and that was AB 5, which instituted the ABC test here in California. And we helped support progressive legislators who wanted to make sure that people were not misclassified. And we went on strike. We led a global strike across the world in May of 2019, and this was right before Uber's IPO, and it really put the fire under a lot of good legislators to make the change here in California, and it did a lot of things globally as well. But we got the AB 5 passed, the governor signed it, and then nothing happened. Nothing changed. The companies continued not to follow basic labor law. So we moved, we moved to a people's enforcement campaign, and we basically, through the Labor Commission, filed wage theft claims. 5,000 of us filed claims, and we got the Labor Commission and the State Attorney General to back us up and sue the companies on behalf of all drivers. And they were just filing an injunction against the companies. And about a month later, we lost everything through the company's proposition, Prop 22, which basically assigned us a permanent second-class status. That our minimum wage would be only based on the time that we had passengers in the car. We had no right to organize a union. I mean, on and on and on. It's literally handcuffs us as workers. So we're continuing to fight, and thankfully, Prop 22 in the lower courts has now been determined unconstitutional, but we're still in this gray area with absolutely no rights. And make no mistake, these companies have hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to spend on changing labor law. So when folks talk about democratizing work, I'm here to say we need to enforce basic labor laws, minimum wage. What I've learned in my international organizing is that minimum wage, Social Security benefits, workers' comp aren't even a thing in many countries, right? So if we don't enforce those laws and make those laws real, we can talk about democratizing work. But right now, I mean, I'm just one part-time driver that is experiencing this. There are full-time drivers, there's full-time app-based workers. I mean, but I have a neighbor across the street who gets $300 a week for full-time work, and she's raising her family and living in a garage with 4 people. This is the world that we're in. So, I don't think that gig work is, that much worse than a whole lot of other things. And it does allow people to turn on the app when they want to work. Those things are things that technology give us. It does not give companies the right to profit off of, not even owning the factory, making you buy the factory yourself. So I think that's my time. And I think that gives some context to how deeply exploitative this work model is. And, this is a majority people of color and immigrant workforce. and they're assigning it in the United States as a second-class labor force. If we don't take control of this federally and also internationally, we're going down the wrong road.
Thank you very, very much, Nicole. I think it's a perfect transition to Veena Dubal, who has put race at the center of her own work. So, Professor Veena Dubal, could you start your remarks by introducing yourself so that everyone gets to know you?
Sure. So, can you hear me properly?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Great. So, forgive the sort of non-traditional setting. I am teaching my class right now. I have 50 students in front of me, and they all can see you and hear you and are going to be participating in a robust discussion because they have been learning about these issues in our class, misclassification issues. This is an employment class. It's always a real pleasure to hear my comrade and sister Nicole Moore speak. I've been following Nicole's work for a really long time. I am a professor of employment law in the University of California at Hastings College of the Law. And for 10 years, over 10 years, I have been studying the ride-hail industry in San Francisco from when it was a taxi industry to now as it is both a taxi and a transportation network company sector as well. I do embedded ethnography, and I'm primarily interested in drivers who are organizing. And so Nicole and I spend a lot of time together, a time in which I have learned so much from her and have such a deep admiration for the work that she and others are doing to better the lives and livelihoods of workers in this sector. So I'm going to be focusing this panel is largely on gig work, and I know that Professor Julie Schor is going to give us a more sort of optimistic perspective, hopefully, on the possibilities of anticipating what she might say based on her work, but on the possibilities of democratizing gig work through cooperative systems. But I'm going to talk primarily about ride-hail work. So when I think of democratizing work, that is creating a work environment in which workers themselves have power and say over pay, working conditions, and work product, I think of three possible avenues. I think of private sector unions, I think of cooperatives, and I think about municipal ownership with public sector unions. And in the ride-hail sector right now in the US, we have essentially two labor markets. In some contexts they're overlapped, but largely two different labor markets, taxis and transportation network companies. Neither of these markets are unionized, but one, at least in major urban areas, is constituted primarily by cooperatives. So the taxi industry's experience with cooperatives, I think, has some bearing on the potentiality of successful cooperatives in the TNC market, in the Uber and Lyft market. And so I'm going to just give you a bit of history about how most major taxi companies in urban areas in the US became cooperatives and what we can learn from that process. So over the course of much of the 20th century, taxi industries all over the country were unionized. And in the late 1970s, due to corruptive practices by their parent companies in California, the largest taxi company, Yellow Cab, ended up going bankrupt and dissolving. And in 1977, they were in bankruptcy proceedings, and a bunch of drivers went to Superior Court here in San Francisco, and they said, hey, we want to purchase Yellow Cab's assets and form our own cooperative company. Patrick Shannon, who was this sort of radical 26-year-old former Yellow Cab driver, was in college studying political philosophy, and he was really excited about the possibility of a just system through cooperatives. He, alongside 185 other former Yellow Cab drivers, pooled all of their resources. They made a bid, and eventually they won. They won the bid. The Superior Court accepted the offer, and they formed the new Yellow Cab Cooperative, in which the drivers themselves were the owners. But perhaps you know the rest of the story, that although the brainchild of workers, the new Yellow Cab Cooperative was far from labor friendly. Indeed, the drivers immediately set up a two-tiered system. So when Yellow Cab opened up, you had the medallion holding drivers who continued to drive. But then, because a car is an asset that can be used 24 hours a day, but a human cannot drive 24 hours a day, they hired or subleased the cars for the 12 hours when they weren't driving. And they, instead of treating those people as workers or as co-owners or as employees, they treated them as independent contractors. So you had 300 medallion holding drivers, and that, you know, constituted what we might call the petite bourgeoisie, and then you had 600 drivers who were independent contractors. The city, San Francisco, and the National Labor Relations Board investigated the possibility that this was an action explicitly taken to prevent unionization, but to no avail. And there was a lot of discussion about how this new cooperative actually was creating a sharecropping situation. 2 years later, there were a number of pickets, a number of protests. I'll just give you a sense of the president of the new cooperative, Jimmy Steele, who was up until recently still involved in Yellow Cab, responded to the picketers, calling them a bunch of radicals. He said they've got a little minority group of people that are trying to disturb a lot of shit for no reason. So they had this two-tiered system that they created, the system of cooperative owners and this lower tier system of workers who did most of the driving. When I started studying the industry, it was this lower tiered system of workers that I was most interested in, and I should say that those workers really were living and working in awful working conditions, not dissimilar from what we see in the Uber and Lyft economy today. And I offer this history to say that truly democratic cooperatives aren't possible in the ride-hail sector, or that they're not desirable, but just to warn that cooperatives too can be exploitative structures, especially when not every person that works or drives is an equal member of the cooperative. Currently, as some of you might know, in the ride-hail sector in New York and increasingly in cities across the country, there's an effort to grow a drivers cooperative as an alternative to compete with Uber and Lyft. And I see that this strategy, I see this largely as a strategy that fails to deal with the political economy of the sector as a duopoly, and that actually is distracting from attempts to by organized drivers like Nicole to get justice. I think it provides a really good story about collective ownership, a feel-good story about collective ownership that suggests that we can find justice via market competition against massive corporations with significant capital who are able to buy their way out of laws and regulations. It's actually incredibly expensive to scale and maintain computational systems, especially customer-facing computational systems. And this is an expense that is not front-loaded, but that is continuous. And so the idea that a small cooperative of drivers could actually compete with Uber and Lyft, I think is, again, sort of a strategy that concerns me. And I worry that part of the strategy that is behind creating these kinds of what I see as impossible cooperatives is to create an illusion of other possibilities and futures without having to engage in union fights, in antitrust fights, in fights that actually are about not just creating alternatives, but actually creating a just political economy in which competition actually might become possible, competition that might include cooperatives. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first drivers cooperative in New York City was incubated within a company union, a workers' association that was being funded partly by Uber and Lyft, and that the current one is run by a former organizer from that worker association. In large part because I see this as occurring against the backdrop of robust organizing to form an official union. The New York Taxi Workers Alliance in New York City, like the Rideshare Drivers United that Nicole is a part of in California, has been engaged in robust organizing efforts. They have achieved what no other union or union-like group has been able to achieve in the country through collective organizing, including a wage floor for drivers and a vehicle cap. And I'll let Nicole talk more about the union fight. And I'm sorry that my comments are, at least at the outset, primarily posed through the negative instead of the positive. But I want to put this history out there that suggests that really to talk about democratizing work through the lens of the gig economy, particularly again in this ride-hail sector, we're really facing an uphill battle, not just with regard to working conditions, as Nicole really beautifully laid out, but also with regard to the extraordinary market power that the companies have been able to create through streams of venture capital funding. And I think that to imagine that we could create alternatives to this that would actually be real competitors through cooperative systems is potentially a distraction from the fights that we need to have both at the antitrust level and at the labor law level. Something that I am excited about potentially beyond sort of the idea of a private sector union is the municipalization of this industry. I think that, as I said at the outset, there are three options here: a private sector union, cooperatives, and municipalization, and a public sector union. And I actually think that there's a lot of precedent to think about the ride-hail sector through the lens of a public utility, and to municipalize the ride-hail industry, and to see it as an extension of and a complement to public transportation. I'll end my comments there.
Thank you very much, Veena. There was a lot packed in those few minutes. Now we're going to turn to Juliet before we can engage into some dialogue and taking questions from the audience. So Juliet, please don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Isabelle.
As you start.
And it's a pleasure to be here with you, Nicole, and Veena. I am an economist and sociologist. I teach at Boston College. I've been studying the gig work for more than 10 years, looking at many different platforms, doing various kinds of research, interview, big data analysis. Last year, I published a book called After the Gig: How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. In my research, I've found, evidence of many of the realities of gig work, talked about primarily by Nicole, but also Veena. So I was asked today to talk about the best case for democratizing. So I don't want my remarks to be interpreted as somehow, that in my work I have failed to see the exploitation and the predatory behavior of many of these companies. I should also say I'm going to talk more broadly than ride-hail, which, as Veena just mentioned, is the most duopolized sector, and I think in many ways, perhaps the most predatory of the sectors. So Nicole touched on some of this, but if we think about gig work, sort of what's quote unquote positive or best case, not necessarily around narrowly thinking about democratizing as governance, but just what is it that gig work offers workers that some other kinds of work don't? Number one, that flexibility and choice of hours. In most jobs, hours are set by employers. There is a penalty to get your choice of hours, to get short hours. Most short hour jobs don't have benefits like gig work, but people need these choice of hours and short hours for many reasons. Many people in the gig economy have other full-time jobs. We find they're combining gig work with care responsibilities. Disabled workers who have uncertainty about their ability to work on any given day. People who are trying to start other businesses, students, etc. So there are a lot of reasons that workers want the flexibility that these jobs offer. And also in our work, we find many workers really value the lack of a boss. Yes, the algorithm becomes a boss. We can talk more about that, but this is something that comes up a lot. At the organization level, the technology obviates a lot of middle management. Now, there's some negative parts to that, but what it also means from the point of view of democratizing work is that that sort of those big layers of middle management that dominate conventional companies aren't necessary. Workers you can delegate a lot more power and control to the workers themselves, and you can sort of wipe out those middle managers. That gives you opportunities for cooperativization, which Veena talked about, I'll get to in a minute. But also at the market level, and this was one of the big sort of selling points in the early days of the sector, can reassign value to workers and to some extent to customers, but away from management. If we think about home health care aides, for example, where that middle management who's doing the work of reputation and trust and so forth, they're taking half the money that the worker is getting. So some of these softwares allow for new forms of work that actually where workers in principle can recover a lot more value. Some of it's technological, some of it's organizational, and some of it's market. And I think the point here is that the technology has the potential to be very, very positive from the point of view, in theory, of the point of view of workers. But if it's owned and controlled by predatory companies who are exploiting the workers and disrupting the small amount of power that workers have, workers are not going to get that. So the question is there a way to get the benefits of the technology without the oppressiveness of the property relations? And the key principle here is to disrupt the property relations, the business model, and the power relations that characterize particularly the big players. The small players there are some who are doing things differently. And so, happy to talk about those, but I'm going to focus a little more. Now, actually, it's interesting to me. Veena and I were given kind of opposite mandates for our talks here, worst, best case, and yet we both sort of organized the option, exactly the same options. So regulation, cooperatives, municipally owned platforms, and I'm going to add one more that we've been looking at, which is informal social media hosted platforms, and I'll say a bit about that in a minute. Regulation. So this has been the dominant approach. In particular, the shift to employee status, which Nicole talked about, as well as, in New York, in ride hail, some minimum wages and some other protections for workers. It's possible. I think you can gain a lot through regulation. Nicole referenced 2018. Which I would also agree was a kind of momentum shift in terms of regulation in the United States, where finally local governments especially started, and the state, in some cases California, saying, hey, wait a second, what's going on here? After all those years of being unwilling to act. Platforms in Europe are beginning to shift to employee status. We have models where workers are getting to choose their status. We have the new rider law in Spain. So regulation is a key aspect of democratization, but it's, like Veena said, it's very dependent on the power relations. And we see when the platforms are too powerful, how they can get around the regulations. I have a study looking at Airbnb regulations in which we find, although when you a city puts in a strict Airbnb regulation, the listings go down, they're trying to get those commercial actors out. Over time, they just creep right back up. So there's a lot of cat and mouse here, and it's very hard. It's very hard once you win a victory to hold it. So agreed, you need to pair regulation with workers' organizations, unions, and unions-like structures, as well as consumer organizations, because consumers are also being mistreated in a number of ways by these platforms. Cooperatives. So this is a far more reaching change, in which the earners themselves, workers and producers, are owning the platforms. I don't disagree with Veena's point about ride hail. I would say I've done one study of a platform co-op which was highly successful, both economically and also governance-wise, in terms of giving voice and power to workers. But there are significant barriers to co-ops. One is financing. The second is the challenge of gaining market share. The third is what I would call the tyranny of the market, in which the co-ops themselves are forced to address, whatever the consumers want, or the competitive aspects, which often lead to a kind of convergence to conventional firms. There's been a lot of excitement about co-ops, but what I would say is that outside of those countries which already have big and well-supported cooperative sectors, you're not going to be able to scale co-ops without strong government participation and support. And that's, again, that supports the argument that Veena made, which is you need an alternative power center to go against the companies, especially when you're in a sector like ride hail. The more, the less monopolized the sector in many ways, the easier it is for co-ops to grow. Yes, my third was municipally owned platforms. There are some places, cities that are dipping their toes in here. I don't know as much about the European cases. In the United States, for example, in Long Beach, California, the city's using money from the pandemic. The city set up a platform for short-term childcare. It's free, so it's not clear, whether it's going to be long-term. But this is a key opportunity. You've got to do it right. If you have a really disequilibrated market where you have many more people looking for work than you have demand, those markets are going to fail. You also have to make sure that the municipality has enough money to put out a really technologically good product, not sort of a clunky old government website that doesn't work because people won't use it. I do know there's been some talk in San Francisco about a municipally owned platform for delivery couriers. And it's interesting, this is one of the areas where we're seeing, New York just passed 6 laws last week, I think it was, or the week before, where we're seeing some real momentum in terms of some things to protect workers. There's like a, the combination of the restaurants getting hammered and the workers getting hammered by the delivery apps. The final option is informal groups that organize on social media. And these are actually really kind of interesting. In Texas, and I'm sure Veena and Nicole know more about this one than I do. In Texas, when Uber and Lyft left because they didn't want to do fingerprinting for their drivers, a group of drivers got together and organized just on, very basic social media, basically a kind of informal co-op, that ride hail co-op. My research group has been studying Facebook groups for care labor, child care workers, and they work extremely well and much better in many ways than the Uber of the child care world, which is care.com. And so it's interesting that there are opportunities for kind of self-organizing in some of these areas. So I've probably talked too long. I'm going to end now. I have one last point. The third day of this global conference is on decarbonization. And I've also been looking at this. This has been a disaster from the point of view of gig work, whether we're talking about ride hail, food delivery, where people are switching from bicycles to cars, or have in many cases, Airbnb and all the induced travel. The big platforms have been a disaster from the point of view of carbon regulation. And democratizing the work itself will not solve that problem. So that is another key dimension of what needs to happen in terms of if we want to think about transforming this sector into something that works for the earners, the workers, for the customers, for the cities, for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juliet. There's a lot, obviously, in what you, the three of you, are bringing to the table. I'm just going to make one observation, which is that in the Democratizing Work Manifesto, there is a tight connection which is made between the democratizing principle and actually the decommodifying principle. And the idea of decommodifying labor is the idea that, well, labor is not a commodity, and so workers should be guaranteed a minimum set of rights that should not be up for discussion, negotiation, bargaining, whatever. And I think that resonates very much with what Nicole said, obviously, because if we were living in a world where these rights, the rights, not only labor rights, basic labor rights, but housing, health, education, if those primary human needs were provided by our collective organization, then obviously we can discuss totally differently about the democratizing principle. So maybe it's important to just inject that into the discussion, because the democratizing principle is really about getting workers in a position where they're going to be able to wait on the conditions of their work, to wait on what is the purpose that is served by the firm for which they are working. And that then connects back to the issue of the decarbonizing, because when workers are able to wait on like the type of service that they serve, we can clearly see that they are very mindful of the type of impacts that they're going to have. We have clear example in the past year, even if that doesn't solve everything. And then I think also we have to inject the dimension that democratized firms would have a much more mutually beneficial relationship with the state, with public power, than obviously capitalist firms are not seeking that, because they are seeking actually to destroy the democratic principle in the police also. But so maybe I see a question in the Q&A. I want to encourage you to voice your questions. I think it would be important to also inject the dimension of race here, which is one key dimension on which Veena has been working. And I feel like there hasn't been enough said about that. So maybe could we ask Veena to like bring that point very clearly, the gig economy being an industry where indeed the injustice done to some is very clear, and the people working in the gig economy are not whatever people. So maybe that should be just on the radar, and then we can then turn to the first question that I see. But then, so please inject your question in the Q&A.
Yeah, I would love to get to that. And Nicole touched on this, but I think Isabelle is referring to a paper that I'm just about to publish called The New Racial Wage Code. And one of the things that I have argued is that the large gig companies, again, I'm not talking about there are potentially a lot of smaller, exciting, more democratically sort of minded entities that are emerging, and Professor Julie Schor's work really highlights some of these. Here in San Francisco, my students might know there's a cooperative called the Candlestick Courier, is a cooperative of food delivery drivers that have a very niche market. So I'm certainly talking about these big corporations like Deliveroo, like Uber, like Grubhub, these companies that do food delivery and ride hail that have become so essential, literally legally essential in the context of the pandemic, and whose labor has become very, very important to many of our lives. What I have written about is that according to these companies' own statistics, the vast majority of people who do this labor are people of color and immigrants. So nationwide in the US, Lyft says that 70% of their workforce is people of color and immigrants. We know based on data here in San Francisco that 80% of people who do ride hail and food delivery are people of color and immigrants. And it is these people who are deprived of all the rights that Nicole and Julie mentioned, the right to a minimum wage, the right to overtime, the right to workers' compensation, the right to unemployment insurance, the right to organize. This is particularly relevant because the companies have been trying to create their own laws, not just here in California, but also now in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in New York. And the idea is a third category of work where a worker is not guaranteed any of these rights and that the companies sort of have their business model rubber stamped. In this third category of work that was created in California under Proposition 22, what the companies did was create a new wage code where workers could not be paid for the first part of each piece of work that they did. So from the time they turn on an app to when they're assigned a job, they are guaranteed no pay. Which means that many of these workers will make less than, and do make less than, the minimum wage, sometimes lose money while working. And what I argued in this particular paper is that we can understand this as a continuation of the racial subjugation of Black and brown workers. We had racial wage codes during the National Industrial Recovery Act. We had de facto carve-outs from the minimum wage protections for agricultural and domestic workers that resulted in generational poverty. And I think that we can understand the codification of a new form, or as Nicole says, a subclass of workers through these types of regulations that the companies themselves are promulgating as the codification of racial subordination. And I think it's very important, given that how both in the U.S. and in Europe, the fact that most of this work is done by migrants, that, as Isabelle says, we really keep this at the forefront of our minds. This is not just an economic justice issue, this is a racial justice issue.
Thank you very much, Veena. I suggest now that we take, there are a few questions. I'm going to read them and then suggest you take, you react, the three of you, to these questions, and you pick whatever elements or so that you feel you prefer to address. So there are questions about the prospects for unionization. So Jose Luis Gallegos asks in the chat, based on the recent experience of Uber workers' successful attempt in the UK by Uber workers to be recognized as employees and thus to potentially unionize. He wonders if this is a trend that you're seeing, if we should be hopeful about that, if this could inspire in some ways also the US. Also citing the case of Amazon workers in Italy, for instance, being able to unionize because this is Europe. Is this a potential inspiration? What's the prospect there? And then another line of questioning about universal basic income or a job guarantee. Would that, and this is about really decommodification, and that connection I was trying to also inject in our thinking earlier, could more decommodification of labor obviously solve the problem of underpayment, and then obviously would change drastically the balance of power between workers and these platforms. So would you like to address those two questions or take any part of them? Nicole, do you want to start, to go first?
Sure. I think, anything that these big companies want for their workforce, the opposite is usually good for us. So in that way, I think the companies are creating a condition of drivers wanting to have a collective voice, collective power, because we can see that we can't do it alone. They're specifically in
I'm sorry.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful.
In the US, they're specifically working on laws to prevent us from unionizing. The Prop 22 makes it clear that we cannot unionize. The other thing is they're hiding behind laws that say 10% of the workforce, if they sign something, then the companies can pick the union that will represent the workers, which is not a worker power model. It's not something that we support, Rideshare Drivers United. Drivers need to lead our own unions. We need to have real power and build our own unions. Because otherwise we end up in company unions picked by the companies to represent the workforce, which is not what we need. So there's definitely a trend of there's definitely a trend of workers wanting to organize, but right now under misclassification.
Yeah, the connection becomes really, I think we lost Nicole now. Okay, so she might be able to come back after a reboot. So I suggest because the time is it's already like 9 before the hour, and we have to stop on time because there are other sessions starting at the next hour. So Juliet,
yes. So let me just say two things. I mean, one has to do with universal basic income. Job guarantee is a little bit different. UBI, if it's high enough, could have a really salutary effect on all low-wage employment, because what it does is it gives workers options. So, and the higher it is, the more it basically gives workers the power to push real wages up. So it's a fantastic tool in that way, and it does work across the economy. One of the big findings of my research is that workers who are more dependent on the platform for to pay their basic expenses have worse experiences, have to endure more exploitation, more jeopardy in terms of bodily risks and other kinds of things. So the more that's done to give people alternatives to the work, the more the companies have to provide a positive context to attract people. That said, there is one part of this whole story that we haven't talked about yet that's very important. If you think about what a company like Uber has been trying to do, number one, it's to wipe out all other sort of forms of transportation for people, in particular public transportation. And its vision was to do that first by predatory pricing, to sort of, they have like they've had about a 40% in the United States, about a 40% subsidy on every ride funded by these VCs. They want to dominate the market, wipe everybody else out. So it's an individualization of something which should be a public good, because the individual model is not, it's first of all, the prices are too low to provide a decent wage and a decent situation to the workers. It will destroy the only hope we have of decarbonizing transportation, which is robust public transportation. And it undermines a democratic option for transport. It's a highly, highly individualized one, and one in which like the idea that ordinary people should have these private services of food privately delivered, transportation privately delivered, taking us in the wrong direction. We need efficient, decarbonized, good public provisioning of the services that are the bedrock of this part of the gig economy. So it's really key that conflict between the price of the services and the, you know, what the workers are being paid. It's at the core, and it's why the basic business model, which, by the way, you know, Uber's the losingest money losingest company in human history, and, you know, since 2016 it's lost more than $25 billion. It's a completely flawed business model on so many different grounds.
Thank you, Juliet. Veena?
Yeah, I mean, I should face this way because the camera is this way. My computer is. Oh, Nicole is back. I want her to finish her comments. Nicole, do you want to finish what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, I was basically just saying that, yes, drivers want to organize. Misclassification is a barrier to it. And you know, and also we do not want to join company unions. We want to build our own power. And, you know, we could have a huge impact on the labor movement if we build powerful unions. And that's what we want to do. And the barriers that these companies are setting up to that, we need to fight them.
I agree, and I also very much agree. And every time I hear Julie speak, learn so much from her. And I had wanted to say at the outset that she's been such a wonderful, amazing mentor to me, and that I'm so grateful to be able to speak with and alongside her. And the same goes for Nicole, who continues to mentor me in all kinds of different ways. To answer sort of the questions, I wanted to first just mention that there is. Just to clarify that what's happening in the UK, despite the Supreme Court decision, is that Uber continues to only pay the drivers for the time that they are after they are allocated work. So they're using a kind of Prop 22 model actually in the UK, even though it's been heralded as a success. And we have yet to see the deal that Uber has made with the union that was actually suing it with regard to recognition. I'm very concerned about the kinds of things, cautiously very pessimistic about the kinds of things that that the union has and Uber are going to ultimately have conversations about. So I actually don't think that that's an exciting move. I think it's an unfortunate one. With regard to the issue of universal basic income and a jobs guarantee, just my thoughts about universal basic income really vacillate, in large part because in Silicon Valley, where I'm located, I hear the people that I am constantly arguing with talk about a universal basic income, and it makes me very, very concerned. There are some interesting experiments with UBI. There's one here in Stockton, just north of us, that have, as Julie articulated, shown really sort of promising results in terms of giving people labor market power. My concerns remain twofold. One, if UBI is not high enough, the existence of UBI, I worry, could be used to lower working conditions and pay, which inevitably, of course, affect the same people that are being impacted by these business models today. And my second concern is oftentimes when we talk about UBI, we don't talk about it in a global context, and I worry that it means that a lot of particularly onerous and low-wage work will sort of be displaced to the global south. And what does that mean for global equality? I'm not sure. Those are just sort of overarching thoughts that I continue to have. But just to end on a more, since I'm ever ever the pessimist. To end on a more optimistic note, I actually just wanted to go back to what Julie was talking about with regard to municipalization of gig work. I think that there's so much potential here. I think that this is actually a place where, even when we're talking about duopolies like Uber and Lyft, where we can actually make a dent in the market, in large part because it would be a place where government was actually controlling and had incentive to control the market in a robust way. So just to throw that out there, that would really address both the decarbonization element, the decommodification element to some extent, not entirely, but also certainly the democratization element of the gig economy.
Well, thank you so much, Veena. We're going to leave it there. It's been an extremely thoughtful, engaging session. I thank you so much, the three of you. Obviously, nothing is solved, but the battle is on. So lots of good thoughts for you, and in the teaching now in the class. Nicole, have a very good day, and Juliet, thank you so much. Thank you all, and let's jump into another session for those who are on the platform. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Thank you very much.